Let's begin our devotional today reading Psalm 55, verse 12. If an enemy were insulting me, I could endure it. If a foe were rising against me, I could hide. But it is you, a man like myself, my companion, my close friend, with whom I once enjoyed sweet fellowship at the house of God as we walked about among the worshipers. Good morning, I am Pastor Carlos Rios, and this is our devotional, Mana, a daily adventure with God. We are going to see how, from the manger to the tomb, there was a phase in the life of Jesus that was very difficult as a human being, as a person, when he experienced that his friends, his disciples, those closest to him, left him, abandoned him, denied him. In the path of salvation, we will notice how there are many areas in our life that highlight who we are in our weakest points. I would like for you to join me in the story of Matthew chapter 26, verse 69 through 75. And so let's take our time to get into this story and how Matthew tells it. Now Peter was sitting out in the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him. "You also were with Jesus of Galilee," she said. But he denied it before them. "I don't know what you are talking about," he said. Then he went out to the gateway where another servant girl saw him and said to the people there, "This fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth." He denied it again with an oath. "I don't know the man." After a little while, those standing there went up to Peter and said, "Surely you are one of them. Your accent gives you away." Then he began to call down curses, and he swore to them, "I don't know the man." Immediately a rooster crowed. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken, "Before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times." And he went outside and wept bitterly. In this path of salvation, I want you to pay attention to what Jesus had to live with those who were closest to him. What is the salvation telling us? On the one hand, Jesus is in danger of death, and despite of this, he remains firm, confronting the threats and the highest authority of the country. On the other hand, Peter is running the risk of being embarrassed and beaten, but gives in when being questioned by the servant girls. On the one hand, Jesus is placed under oath to speak the truth, he himself, and he does it. On the other side is Peter, emitting words of judgment, of cursing, to deny the truth in regards to himself and Jesus. On the one hand, Jesus is there falsely accused of blasphemy. And this in itself is incredible, the Son of God being accused of blasphemy. But on the other hand is Peter, truly guilty of blasphemy in the presence of God himself. In fact, the text says that not only did he falsely swear using the name of God in vain to lie, but it also says that he began to curse and to swear. Furthermore, some translations of the Bible say that he began to curse himself, but Matthew only says that he began to curse. And it is perfectly possible to deduct that he began to curse Jesus himself, saying things like, "I swear to God, I do not know this man. May he be cursed." How terrible, no? This Peter, when recognized by a servant and threatened, he is able to escape cursing and swearing. And on the other hand, when Jesus looks at him, as Luke tells us, Peter goes and hides in the darkness while the rooster is crowing, remembering the word Jesus had spoken. My dear family of Mana, here we have Peter, and we can say that this morning we will talk about the villain of the story, Peter, the man that took up a sword in the darkness in the garden when facing a squadron of soldiers. However, a few hours later, before Jesus died, in this event, he folds when confronted by a servant in the light of a bonfire. Peter, who's able to take up an entire net filled with fish, now is melting in fear when confronted with suspicious questions. Peter, the man who swore that he would die for Jesus, and even so, here he is swearing that he does not even know him. Peter, a man filled with conviction and good intentions, just a few hours prior. Despite of this, now in this moment, he is filled with shame, with bitterness, with profound desperation and tears overflowing. Peter, the rock, the name Jesus had given him, now drowning in his own cry. To summarize, Peter fails suddenly, surprisingly, utterly. Peter failed. And so what is the Bible telling us in regards to failure this morning? Think about this. Let's have a mental review throughout the Bible. Adam and Eve failed, although they lived in a perfect environment. Abraham failed lying in regards to his wife and took Hagar. Samuel was not able to make his own children behave correctly, despite beginning his own career condemning Eli because of for the same reasons. Gideon failed even after his great victory against the Midianites when he said that he would not become king, that behaving as if he were making an object, causing Israel to fall in idolatry. Moses failed in the desert and regretted it tremendously. The great King David failed terribly, not only in his acts of adultery and murder, but also at a family level. All the kings of Israel failed in one way or another. The people of Israel altogether, the people of the covenant of God, God's redeemed people failed generation after generation throughout the entire Old Testament. And if we go to the New Testament, everywhere we see people who also failed, even in this very story. So why do we just blame Peter for denying Jesus? In fact, Matthew tells us that all the disciples abandoned him and fled. Peter was almost the only one, as we will see, who remained in a place where he would be able to deny Jesus. Do you know what the only reason why the other disciples did not deny Jesus was? It was because they were not even there. This morning, we are talking about the path from the manger to the cross. And here we find the word failure. And failure is an experience that we will witness each day. Many of us have an idea of the great story of the Christian church. We know that the gospel has spread across the world, from country to country, from continent to continent. We have read the biographies of some missionaries, and we admire the great works of these brave men and women who have done great things for God's work. And it is spoken about truly the great stories of the last 2,000 years, the great things that the gospel has achieved with its grace and the sovereignty of God. But if you look at the church from another angle, the church also throughout these 2,000 years has also been a story of failures, and some of these very terrible. Just as in the Old Testament, sometimes these stories surprise us in regards to what God has done despite the weaknesses and the failures of people that He has used. Instead of being marveled by the achievements of these same people, sometimes the biography of the great men of God do not take into account some of the least inspiring moments, those moments of failure. And it is a great tragedy that we often do not do this, or we do not want to admit it. And to be honest, we feel ashamed when other Christians begin to confess their failures, perhaps in fear of having to join the confession and admitting that some of ours Furthermore, that us ourselves, we have failed many times. Sometimes we prefer to hide our embarrassment and to pretend that we have a victorious Christian life, a life filled of the Spirit, with the Spirit, and any other phrase that is trending. We cannot continue to believe that we have everything under control, but we must today more than ever admit that we are weak, that we have made many mistakes. Failure is foreseen in the Bible. And one of the most surprising points of Matthew 26, the story that we are talking about this morning. Look at how Matthew 26 talks to us about the betrayal of Judas and the denial of Peter. And Jesus had foreseen both. He had predicted both. If you read verse 21 of Matthew 26, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me." They were very sad and began to say to him, one after the other, "Surely you don't mean me, Lord." It was a great surprise, and apparently even now, at this advanced stage of the story, none of the other disciples were suspicious of Judas. But if we move along to verse 31 of Matthew 26, Jesus told them, "This very night you will all fall away on my account. You will abandon me." And they all said, "No, no, we will not do such a thing." Especially Peter, who replied, "Even if all fall away, I will never." To which Jesus answered, "Truly I tell you, this very night before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. Notice that here this morning we are talking about the failure of Judas, the failure of Peter, and of course of all the others. And all this failure, all these things that were going to occur were tragically predicted by Jesus, and apparently this did not cause or make any difference to Judas. But in regards to Peter, I believe this is probably what saved him, because when he went out into the darkness and cried bitterly, he must have remembered that Jesus knew all along. Jesus said, "I would do this," and this probably caused his tears to be even the more bitter. Think about the way Jesus must have looked at him that day. This makes me understand this morning that perhaps all our failures are predicted, but there is also a great lesson in our reading today. We can still trust Jesus despite all of this, and this leads us to the third and last thing that Peter discovered in the story. Peter discovered that not only is failure a fact, not only has it been predicted, but failure also receives forgiveness. Did you hear what I said, my dear listener? Failure receives forgiveness. Without any doubt whatsoever, the tears of Peter were real tears, and they were also tears of repentance that in this last moment led to Peter's restoration. And how did this happen? Luke and John give us the answer. Luke talks to us about the way Jesus prayed for Peter's faith, and John talks to us about how Jesus brought out Peter's love, and these two things were the key for Peter's restoration. Look at how Jesus prayed for Peter in Luke chapter 22, verse 31 and 32. Luke writes that right before warning Peter that he would deny him 3 times, Jesus says, "Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat, but I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers." And this prayer was answered. And so notice that Peter's faith did not fail because Jesus prayed so that it would not happen. Have you failed Jesus? Of course you have. You and I have failed him many times. But truly the most adequate question this morning is, when was the last time you failed Jesus? And so the key question is, do you still trust in him? Did you fail Jesus again? Of course you did. Of course, I have done it many times. But the question is, do we continue to trust in him? Why did Peter fail? Why did he believe that he could trust in himself? He protested out loud, bravely, that he would never abandon Jesus, that he would go to prison, that he would die, but never deny Jesus. Peter trusted in his own courage and his own strength, but he fell on his face, on the ground, devastated, dishonored. But the question is, what will you do after this? And the answer is, return to Jesus, who intercedes for you so that your faith will survive. Peter knew that he could still trust in Jesus, even when he could no longer see or know what this meant. Peter's restoration was dependent on his faith continuing, and this was dependent on God's assured response to Jesus' prayer. Now, in John 21, verses 15 through 19, Jesus brings out Peter's love. And so Jesus did not only pray for Peter's faith, he then prayed, bringing out Peter's love, as we see in the Gospel of John. And we are very familiar with the story. We know it well. Jesus prepares the breakfast for his disciples after they had gone out to fish, and after another miracle involving many fish. After they had all eaten and they began to do things around the lake, Jesus asked Peter the following question 3 times, over and over again. Peter, do you love me? Let's go back to John 18. Right now we are in John 21, verses 15 through 19. But if you go back to John 18, remember that the soldiers had just arrested Jesus at the garden, and that they had tied him, bringing him to the Jewish court. Simon Peter and the other disciples followed Jesus, and because the other disciple was known by the high priest, he went into the court of the high priest with Jesus. But Peter instead had to remain outside by the door. But then the disciple known by the high priest once again went out. He spoke with the door guard and was able to allow Peter to come in, as it says in John 18, verses 15 and 16. When we read the story, we understand that the other disciple this text is talking about is John himself, because John always talks about himself as the other disciple. And so John made sure that Peter could come in to the court where Annas and Caiaphas, the high priests, were. John saw and heard when Peter denied Jesus and cursed Jesus. John was present when Peter denied Jesus over and over again, rejecting him. John heard Peter say that he did not even know Jesus. This Jesus who both of them loved, the same Jesus for whom both had denounced everything they had, everything they did just 3 years ago. Do you recall the 3 whom Jesus always walked with? Peter, James, and John, the most intimate group of his disciples. They have walked, they had spoken, they had eaten together. Jesus even visited Peter's home, healing his mother-in-law. Wasn't it Peter who affirmed that this Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of God? Peter, who had gone up to the Mount of Transfiguration with Jesus, who had been with Jesus the whole time. Furthermore, during the Last Supper, Jesus washed Peter's feet. And now here, John is seeing Peter in surprise, astonished, while he denies over and over again having known Jesus. And he does so through swearing, cursing, blasphemy. John was there. Tremendous, no? And so paint the scene when Peter and John met again after Jesus' resurrection. What could they have said to one another when thinking about this agonizing moment that they went through after the crucifixion? Can it be that Peter begged John to not say anything to the rest of the disciples? How could Peter once again talk about his love for Jesus with John present? However, this is exactly what happened, and it is precisely John who is talking to us about this, because we are reading the story in John 21. This did not happen out of Peter's initiative, but instead with Jesus bringing it out of Peter with the questions, Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me more than these? Peter, do you love me? 3 times, the same amount of times that Peter denied Jesus. The connection is obvious. Jesus knows it, Peter knows it, and John is listening. But pay attention. Who is asking the question? It is written in John 21, but who is asking the question is Jesus, already resurrected. This Jesus who had already been on the cross, who had already been in the tomb. It is about Jesus who had taken upon himself all of Peter's guilt, his failure, his disgrace, his humiliation, his sin. All of Peter's embarrassment was taken by Jesus to the cross. Your shame and mine. And this is the Jesus that asks, Peter, do you love me? And Peter answers, Lord, you know that I love you. I have always loved you, and I continue to love you, even when I was denying you. I loved you. It broke my heart, and you knew it. I hated myself for it, but I loved you, and I love you now. I love you, Lord. And this is what John needed to hear. Because if Jesus forgave Peter, then he too was to forgive him. He was able to love Peter again because they both loved Jesus. And this is why John writes it for us as well. And so Peter, the failure, becomes Peter, the forgiven. From the manger to the cross, there is a great story of failure, of forgiveness that has to do with all of us. Father, thank you for this morning. We ask for your blessing, and we ask that you go in front of us. Care for us and guard us in Christ Jesus. Amen and amen. I await for you tomorrow in our Friday of Prayer in Mana. Blessings to all.